Du lytter til Radio Krishna på 87,6 MHz. I dag har jeg med mig i studiet Madhavendra Puri, som vi kender fra mange forelæsninger og også et interview, der blev lavet i 90 af min gudsbror Madhava Puri. Og i dag har jeg ham igen i studiet for at snakke om, hvad han laver i dag. Welcome to the studio, Madhavendra Puri Prabhu.
Thank you.
About 10 years ago, one of my colleagues from Radio Krishna in Sweden made an interview with you about the topics you were working with at that time. And I would like to, first of all, ask you, before we go into the continuation of those topics, I would like to ask you to give a little brief explanation of the Bhaktivedanta Institute as an entity within the Krishna Consciousness movement.
Śrīla Prabhupāda founded the Bhaktivedanta Institute in the early 70s because the modern Western educational system based on science is misconstrued to support a worldview in which there is no soul and no God. It's not that science is actually saying that there is no soul and God, it's just that many people think that that is what science is saying.
But isn't that the general conception of reality if you ask most individual scientists?
Yeah, if you ask the more mundane or technician or engineering type scientists, the highest scientists, the real ones like Einstein, had a much different view. They were open to ideas about the soul and God. Of course they want evidence, so it really hinges on evidence, very good and solid evidence. But science as it is taught in the school somehow has become a vehicle for showing a worldview where there's no soul and no God. It doesn't have to be taught like that. And that's because the administrators and the inferior scientists and technical people have that materialistic worldview which they're trying to push. And so they use scientific terms and scientific arguments to try to push that particular worldview, when science itself doesn't necessarily say that.
Do you feel that within the last 10 years that there's been any change?
There, in the field of molecular biology, which is what I'm dealing mostly with, there has been a change more towards an open-mindedness of God as the designer of our bodies, of the bodies of all living entities. For example, in 1996, Professor Michael Behe at Lehigh University, a famous biochemist, published a book called Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution, in which he analyzed a number of systems within our bodies. Anywhere you look in our cells, you'll find fantastic complexity. And he analyzed this and shows that such complexity is beyond the reach of chance within the short 4.5 billion year age of the Earth, or even within the 15 or 20 billion year age of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, random processes are very slow. If you want to produce organization by random processes, it's very slow. To give an example, if you want to type a letter and you close your eyes and you just randomly hit keys, of course, good typists know where the keys are. It should be a randomly redone keyboard with the letters, with the keys mixed into a new pattern that are not a non-standard pattern, and then a blindfolded typist.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to produce organized sentences or even words, you'll find it takes fantastically long periods of time because the vast majority of combinations that you hit are going to be nonsense.
But is there any evidence of ever anything which we can call organization coming out of from chaos?
Only in insignificant levels of organization. For example, a sodium chloride crystal, salt. Someone will point to crystal growth and say, aha, from disorganization you get organization.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's true, but the level of organization is insignificant compared to what you need for life.
Mm-hmm.
A sodium chloride crystal of salt, or any simple crystal that you might see, like diamond, is just a few atoms held in a particular arrangement and repeated over and over again millions of times. Just like a simple pattern, you could imagine a square or a triangle, atoms in a triangle, or atoms in a square, and just repeat that over and over again, squares and triangles alternating for millions of different repeating units of the same thing. So that doesn't do anything. It sits there. Or maybe you could say it grows linearly, and then that's it. You don't have reproduction or thoughts or eating or all the things that a living organism does.
So why did Śrīla Prabhupāda make this institution? What was his purpose in connection with Krishna consciousness?
People view Krishna consciousness as a belief system. In other words, it is postulated there is God and there is the soul, and there can be a relationship between God and the soul. That's bhakti, that relationship. But someone will say, well, what evidence is there for the existence of the soul or evidence for the existence of God? Because people want evidence, especially scientific evidence. Science enjoys a great prestige in the modern world. So it turns out that there is a lot of interesting scientific evidence for the soul, that conscious self, non-physical conscious self, soul, unit of consciousness, which can function independently of the physical body, and I've spoken on this at great length.
Mm-hmm.
And we can touch again on this.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also interesting evidence for the existence of God as the designer from molecular biology.
You mentioned molecular biology previously. I recall you said that was a field where there has been some kind of opening.
Yeah.
Within the time.
In the last 10 years.
Yeah. So maybe you can touch upon that a little more into detail, if that's of general interest, you think.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. As I mentioned, this Professor Behe at Lehigh University published this book, which has now become extremely famous. On the internet, there's so many arguments back and forth about the issue of design, were our bodies designed or not. Do the molecules themselves, the way in which molecules work within the body, that's what we mean by molecular biology. How molecules in living organisms work. Do the ways in which they work indicate design? And according to Behe, they do. And he gives some very interesting examples of this. And what I'm trying to do is precise calculations which will allow you to show that mutation and natural selection are too slow and cannot produce our bodies within 4.5 billion years.
Is that what you have been specializing in for the last 10 years? Or?
Yes. You might say.
Would you like to share some of it? Is it of interest?
Yeah, I think it is quite interesting. I'll try to make it as non-technical as possible.
Okay.
It's basically, if you suppose in front of your house you see a car, it's a fair question to ask, was the car designed by an intelligent agent, or did it come about by natural forces such as wind, rain, and hurricanes? It's a question you can ask. That's essentially what it boils down to with our body. You look at this body. Was it designed, or is it the result of impersonal random forces accumulating over long enough time periods? So to answer that question, you have to look at what kind of forces you got, impersonal forces, and how complex your car or body is. So if you look at a car engine, you'll see it's fairly complex, a number of moving parts, very precisely arranged and working together coordinatedly, and the kind of forces you have, wind and rain, don't produce that. So everyone will agree that that car was designed. So now we look at the body. We find the body is trillions and many many uncountable trillions of times more complicated than a car. But the forces that the evolutionists marshal in support of the random production of a body are also more complicated, so we have to analyze them, namely mutation and natural selection. So what mutation means is changes in the DNA. DNA is a blueprint. It tells you how to build the proteins, and the proteins are the workers, they're the doers. They put together other molecules, they decode the information, the DNA, to build other kinds of proteins. They're the structural elements.
So that's what is in the genes, or?
Well, a gene is a unit, a part of the DNA.
Uh-huh.
Let's start by talking about the DNA. It's like a circular staircase in a submarine.
Okay.
If you've seen if everyone can envision walking up the stairs of a circular staircase within a submarine.
Yeah.
Probably everyone has seen this.
Yeah.
So every time you put your foot on one of the rungs of the ladder or steps of the staircase, you're going upward. So in DNA, every one of those steps is called a nucleotide.
Which means?
Nucleotide is just a kind of molecule, and every 3 of these nucleotides codes for one amino acid, and the amino acids are the units that make proteins.
Okay.
So now with this we have to understand very clearly. There are 4 different kinds of nucleotides. You could think of like different flavors of ice cream.
So again, these are the steps of the staircase.
These are the steps, each nucleotide. And it forms a language because at every step there can be one of 4 different kinds of nucleotides, 4 different flavors of ice cream. Chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, and pistachio. So you got 4 different flavors. So that means you have a language consisting of a word being 3 steps or nucleotides, and according to which kind of flavor ice cream is in which of those positions, it tells you which kind of amino acid to put in a protein. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids, biologically relevant amino acids, that you can put into a protein chain, and according to which amino acid is in which position, the protein folds around and functions as a machine. It does things in the cell. It moves molecules. It forms structural elements like the skin and muscles. Everywhere you look, you see proteins. They're the ubiquitous, ever-present doers of everything. And the DNA is just passive. It's just an information storage, like a library. It just sits there until then the proteins come and read it and produce other proteins according to the instructions in the DNA.
Is that according to the combination of the 4 various kind of nucleotides?
Yes.
Like ones and zeros in a computer program?
Yeah, exactly like that. Mm-hmm. Except with ones and zeros you only have 2. You have a language consisting of 2 options.
But here we have 4.
4.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a language consisting of 4 different options at each step.
Mm-hmm. And
each word of that language is 3, happens to be 3 steps.
So a word consists of 3 steps of a combination of 4 possible nucleotides.
Yeah, 4 possible nucleotides at each step.
Each step.
And so every 3 nucleotides codes for one kind of amino acid. There are 20 different, you can think of 20 different colors.
Mm-hmm.
So then a protein is a chain, because the protein is forming now according to the instructions, with different colors, red, green, blue, purple, 20 different shades, you could imagine. So it forms a chain with these amino acids, and then as soon as it's produced, it folds up because the amino acids have positive and negative charges in different places.
Mm-hmm.
Everything works by positive and negative charges. It's very simple. Because an amino acid is an array of 20 or so atoms with positive and negative charges sticking out in various places, so the whole thing folds up into a certain pattern, machine-like structure called a protein. And a gene is just a length of 1,000 or so nucleotides, because one gene codes for one protein, basically. And a protein has about 300 amino acids. So every 900 or 1,000 of these steps, nucleotide steps, encodes a particular protein.
So your work is to show that this could not have come about by random selection.
Yeah, that random mutation and natural selection based on that. We show, what I'm trying to show is that process is too slow. Just as when you type, a blindfolded typist on a randomly reoriented keyboard, to produce organized words, if you even want to spell your last name by a random process, you'll find it takes a very long time. It takes many years, actually, if you're hitting the keys, as fast as you can. It could take years. You can calculate it.
Yeah, or even, I could imagine that in practical terms it would really never happen.
It will happen, actually, if you give long enough time.
Yeah. Because
you're bound to randomly hit, ultimately you will get anything. But the more complicated, the longer the number of letters, the longer it'll take to reach it. You will definitely get it. Because in the first position you can hit, say, 1 out of 26 letters. And then in the second position, suppose you got the first one right, suppose your name is Brent. So the first one you want is to be a B. Okay, so after 5 minutes, say you hit a B in the first position. That's okay. But the problem is the next letter you got wrong.
Yeah.
And then you can actually calculate. In fact, if it's Brent, it's 26 raised to the 5th power, which is a pretty large number.
Yeah.
Then you have to calculate how often you're hitting per second, and then you can translate that into the amount of time that you would need to wait before a random process will give you a particular organization that you're looking for, namely the 5 letters of Brent. So you can calculate then, if you know the rate at which random mutations are going on, you can calculate how long it will take for such random mutations to produce the level of organization in the body.
Yeah, but within that calculation, I think, as far as I understand, has to be what is the possibility of a situation that allows for these kind of reactions even to take place in the first place. You have to go back all the way to the Big Bang, and then why should things organize instead of fall apart?
Well, if you want to show design, all you need to show it is that at any one point there's a bottleneck that doesn't work. In other words, you only have to show that random processes fail at any particular point. Because everything has to be just right to reach a human being. And the other systems are very difficult to calculate. For example, what is produced by a Big Bang? That's very hard to calculate. You don't have a simple system, as I mentioned, with staircase-like with steps of nucleotides. You don't have. So in the field of astrophysics, it's a very complicated business to try to say how, from an explosion, first of all, what gives rise to the explosion? What does the singularity really mean? How it expands? This is something way out of my field of expertise.
Okay, because Sadāpūta, he mentions in some of his lectures that the Big Bang theory rests upon 2 theories, which
quantum physics
and relativity.
And they contradict each other.
Yeah, so I don't know, this is not your field of expertise, but have they ever made any attempts, as far as you know, to unite these 2 theories, or will they always be, by definition?
Well, there's definitely scientists working on unified field theories to unify all of the forces. But as it stands now, quantum physics is non-local, and relativity is local, so they clash at a fundamental level.
So still, even so many years later, the Big Bang theory really doesn't exist, or what?
Well, it's not really together yet. It's quite speculative. There are many question marks.
Which is interesting, because that's the whole origin of everything. So if science or if physicists don't even have that together, you could ask yourself the question, what have they anyway?
Yeah, that is it. But I'm not expert enough to speak on that subject. That's a highly technical field that one must specialize in also.
So your work is to go within the system that we know we have right now and say it's not possible mathematically to have.
Well, we know what a human body or any kind of body or bacterium is made out of, namely DNA and proteins, of course other things like fats and lipids. But the main essence of life is proteins and DNA. That's very clearly obvious because if you can look at it under an electron microscope, you can see all these things going on. The systems are very clearly defined and have been studied hundreds of thousands of times in universities. So that's very clear. I'm not even dealing with the primordial soup and how you get amino acids. That's another problem.
So you're not intending to go into that problem at all?
That would be interesting also. That's another point at which one could challenge evolution. But I'm not expert on that. It's called prebiotic chemistry. Mm-hmm. How you actually produce DNA and proteins. Mm-hmm. It's quite an interesting problem. One scientist named Robert Shapiro at University of New York wrote a book a few years ago casting grave doubt on this primordial soup. He's a chemist, very expert chemist. And just based on chemistry, he's showing that in Miller's experiment, you get only a few amino acids, the simplest ones, glycine and a little bit of alanine and hardly any others. So you cannot produce useful proteins with those.
Is that what they refer to usually when they speak about the primordial soup?
Yeah, Miller's experiment is a classic.
Where he got some brownish gunk on his electrodes.
Yeah, so the brownish gunk is basically nothing useful for living systems. The useful parts occur in very low concentrations, and they're intermixed with all kinds of not useful things which are able to combine with the useful ones and produce junk.
But still, the Miller's experiment is what they refer to as evidence or to defend the...
Ignorant persons cite Miller's experiment as an example of life being produced from chemicals.
Okay.
However, it's interesting to note in the newest textbooks they have scientific disclaimers. After giving Miller's experiment and other ideas of how chemicals can organize into life, in modern textbooks there's a disclaimer saying although this is the best scientific ideas we have today, there are valid scientific objections to this scenario. Mm-hmm. This did not, 10 years ago they didn't have that. So this is a new interesting development.
So it seems like some things are going in, if not theistic, at least an opener direction.
That's definitely true. That you can definitely say about the last 10 years. Also the state of Kansas, showing that evolution is not very scientific, should not be taught as a scientific theory.
Kansas.
The state of Kansas in America. Many scientists were alarmed. They called in big scientists from Harvard in Boston, flew them in 2,000 miles to Kansas is in the middle of the country. They're more pious people, Christians and fundamentalists live around the middle of the country.
Okay.
So the evolutionists and scientific types from Boston and Harvard, which is like the super evolutionary kind of viewpoint, they were very alarmed, so they flew in, to try to defend the theory of evolution.
Did it have any significant impact?
Well, I don't know the outcome. But a lot of scientific doubts were raised to the theory of evolution. And Judah Karmapur was there with his forbidden archaeology, the fossil record evidence.
But that is a separate field. That's dealing with the fossil record.
Yeah, that's quite separate from molecular biology.
And you're dealing with the probabilities of the mathematics within.
Yeah. If you want to establish design by God, you need only show that at any point along the way that intelligent intervention is required. If someone were expert enough in the laws of physics, perhaps he could do it at the level of the singularity expanding into a universe. But I don't know how to do that. It deals with very highly specialized topics in astrophysics and quantum physics. So I'm not attacking at that point, nor am I The next issue is once you get stars, the Big Bang is supposed to have exploded and produced stars. First gas, then the gas accumulates into stars, and the stars from that, planets are formed around the stars. That's a whole other question, whether planets really do form or not. In Origins, we mentioned some scientists who say that theories of planetary formation don't work out at all. You should just have gas and dust and nothing more. But again, I'm not expert enough to get into that. But now I'm assuming you've got planets, and then you've got water on the planet. That's probably not so hard because there's hydrogen and oxygen around. How you get oxygen is a more difficult thing. But anyway, I'm giving them water on a planet, and then I'm not even, asking the question of where you got the proteins and DNA from. I'm assuming that's already existing, and you already have functional cells. So I'm already way along. Now I'm just asking the question, if you have a single-celled organism like a bacterium, do you get cats and dogs and fish, elephants and humans, which is what you're supposed to get?
So that's
what I'm asking.
Okay.
And if you can defeat the theory of evolution at this point, then evolution is totally defeated. At any point, if you could show after you get water on a planet that you can't get proteins and DNA, evolution is also defeated. Mm-hmm. At any point, if you're expert enough in the particular science that deals with that, you could challenge evolution. So I chose a point which has been so well studied that the picture is very clear. Namely, that the circular staircase of the DNA is utterly clear from innumerable experiments and electron micrographic analysis and X-ray crystallography, which is how they first worked out the structure in 1953, Watson and Crick. So that's very crystal clear, just like, your living room furniture. There's no doubt about the structure of DNA. Mm. No doubt that every 3 nucleotides encodes 1 amino acid. And no doubt that amino acids hook together and form proteins, and the proteins are the doers and the structural elements in the cell. That's all crystal clear. So here, the reason I'm using this is it's a well-defined system, just like an automobile in front of your house. You can study it. You can ask, can this thing happen by accident? Now the difficulty comes in doing computations, because you have 20 different kinds of amino acids that fit that hook together. At any position in the chain, you've got a chain of amino acids that makes a protein. At any position, you can have one of 20 different amino acids. Imagine them as different colors. You could imagine a necklace of pearls, and each pearl has a different color. So each of the differently colored pearls represents an amino acid, and the whole chain represents a protein. The difference is that at the level of molecules, after the chain is formed, it folds into a machine-like structure that does something, like a washing machine or a microphone or something.
So the pearl folds together to a...
Yeah, because of electrostatic interactions.
Not the pearl, the necklace. So
yeah.
The necklace folds together to some kind of a...
Yeah, the necklace folds together because each of the pearls has different arrays of positive and negative charges which cause them to attract and repel each other and fold up in a complicated fashion.
Right, okay.
Better to even think of that the necklace has been cut, because that's what it is. It doesn't hook around to a circle, generally. What you have is, imagine a very long necklace consisting of 300-400 pearls, because it's about 300-400 amino acids in a typical protein. So imagine you've got, after it's produced by the protein synthesis machinery of the cell, which is also proteins, fantastically complicated proteins. So after you produce this long chain of pearls, then because different pearls have different attractions to other pearls and different repulsions to certain other kinds of pearls, the whole thing then folds up into a machine. It's just exactly like a robot. Each protein is a machine. You should think of it like that. It's a robot-like machine that does a certain function impersonally because of its shape, just like a car engine or a washing machine.
That in itself is remarkable.
Yeah. So when you have machines, it's natural to ask the question of who designed the machines. And the evolutionists or atheists will say that random events are sufficient to produce these machines given long enough periods of time, and 4.5 billion years is long enough. However, they have never, ever calculated. They have never shown that 4.5 billion years is enough. And in fact, all preliminary calculations of the sort that I and other scientists have done indicate that 4.5 billion years is not nearly long enough to produce the level of organization in our bodies. That in fact you need trillions of times the age of the universe. Modern estimates of the age of the universe is 15 to 20 billion years. The age of the Earth is 4.5 billion. So even given 20 billion years, estimates by various scientists, such as Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickramasinghe, he and other scientists have done calculations which indicate that 4.5 billion or 20 billion years is not nearly long enough for random events to produce the level of organization in our cells. What we mean by random events is like an ultraviolet ray, like when you go out in the sunshine. If you stay out too long in California, because it's always sunny, you have to wear sun cream because the ultraviolet rays are impinging and hitting your DNA and changing nucleotides randomly, and that can cause skin cancer. See, cancer or any a type of disease such as cancer involves if you randomly change nucleotides, you code for junk proteins that cause problems, that don't do the function they're supposed to do, and that's why the cell goes crazy. One of the causes, of course, cancer is much more complicated. But one cause of difficulties are what is called random mutations to the DNA. And that simply means that an ultraviolet ray of light, for example, a photon of light coming in will hit one of the nucleotides and change one flavor of nucleotide to another kind of nucleotide, and therefore that now encodes a new amino acid in a protein. And that randomly substituted new amino acid may may produce junk, or even worse than a neutral mutation, it may produce something that's negative, has a very negative effect on the body. So the evolutionists say that such random mutations as UV radiation and other random causes, that they will actually produce useful things given enough time. They say, starting with a bacterium, a single-celled replicating, a bacterium is a single-cell organism that replicates itself. It does fine. It lives perfectly happily. It just creates copies of itself. It's very successful. And in our experience, 100 years of laboratory observation, bacteria never change into anything else. Bacteria are always bacteria. You can get new kinds of bacteria, but you don't find that a bacterium changes into a cat, or even a fish, or a worm. You don't get anywhere higher. This is the whole key point.
But they may mutate according to the external environment and according to new kinds of penicillin and all that.
Yeah, well, that's another example. They can develop penicillin resistance.
And that seems to be like an event in favor of evolution.
It seems that way to ignorant persons.
Yeah.
But what it really means, like penicillin resistance or other such new kinds of bacteria, it only involve one or two changes in the nucleotides. If you only have to change one or two nucleotides at a time, that's reasonable. Because the probability of changing one particular nucleotide into another by random mutations is 10 to the minus 9th, or 1 out of a billion, roughly. This is published in numerous books nowadays. You can go to any library, any standard biochemical textbook. The rate at which random mutations occur, single nucleotide changes, which are called point mutations, that rate is about 10 to the minus 9th or 10 to the minus 10th. 10 to the minus 10th in the latest analysis. Observation, I should say. This is numerous observations on bacteria. So if penicillin resistance is achieved by changing a single nucleotide, then you would expect it, because you can have, within your hand, you can have 10 to the 10th power bacteria. Mm-hmm. See, a probability alone is not enough to tell you whether something will happen or not. You need a probability, and you need to know how many random flips of the dice you've got. To see this, we have to go back one step. Like if you're flipping coins. If I'm flipping a coin, there's a 50-50 chance of getting heads or tails. But now suppose you and me are both flipping coins, and we want heads to come up on both of our coins. So the chance is 1/2 for me and 1/2 for you. Now it's 1/4. It's 1 out of 4. Now suppose you and me and another person, we have 3 people, and we're all flipping coins, and we want all of them heads at the same time. Now it's 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2 is 1 out of 8. So the key point now is the more things you need to happen at the same time, the lower the probability, because you multiply the individual probabilities to get the overall probability.
They don't just add.
They don't add, they multiply.
Which is significant.
It's very significant. This is what creates severe difficulties for the theory of evolution. This is why I said the calculations which have been done thus far indicate that 4.5 billion years is not nearly long enough. It's trillions of times too small. The age of the universe even is trillions of times too short for random events, like I was talking about the typewriter example. In a cell, you need words of great precision and very long. So you need very long time periods, and they exceed the age of the universe by trillions of times. But to really see this, you have to get into the calculations, which are fairly complicated. I'll try now to give a picture. We're moving along. I'm still not finished with the basic picture. I can give a clearer understanding as we... First, I'll finish with the coin example, and then I'll relate it to how what we're trying to do is calculate whether proteins and DNA can form randomly. So, as I was mentioning, if you're flipping coins, the more people you have flipping, and you want everyone to have heads up at the same time, the lower the probability. So with penicillin resistance, you only need 1 coin to be flipped, or in other words, you need only change 1 nucleotide to confer penicillin resistance on a bacterium. So if the chance is 1 out of 1 billion that you hit the right nucleotide, which is the observed rate in the laboratory, and you have 1 billion bacteria, then you can expect to see that in 1 generation, which is 20 minutes.
Okay, so that's why it's happening.
Right, that's why it happens. Now, if you need something more complicated, like if you want to produce a fish out of a bacterium, you need to change, literally, you need thousands of coordinated changes. And if each change is 1 out of 1 billion, then you have to multiply 1 out of 1 billion times itself thousands of times. So now you're talking about numbers like 10 to the minus 1,000th power. And you cannot, if you fill up the whole earth with bacteria, a whole soup, a primordial soup, 10 kilometers deep, a global ocean that covers the whole earth 10 kilometers deep, you can only fit 10 to the 30th power bacteria. And since each changing 1 nucleotide has a probability of 10 to the minus 9th or 10 to the minus 10th, if you need to change more than 3 nucleotides simultaneously, then you will not expect to have such a transition on the Earth. 3? Yeah, because that's 3, you have 10 to the minus 9th times itself 3 is 10 to the minus 27th. And you've already covered the maximum amount you can get on an Earth planet.
That means 27 zeros.
10, it's 1 over 10 to the 27th power. Or you could say, you put your decimal point here and you have 27 zeros and then you have your 1. In other words, it's a fantastically small number. But then again, as I was mentioning, the probability alone must be balanced against the number of random trials you have. So the number of random trials in this case is the number of bacteria you can fit on the Earth and the number of replications or generations. So if the age of the Earth is 4.5 billion years, is 10 to the 17th power seconds. And every 10 to the 3rd seconds, or 1,000 seconds, you have 20 minutes, which is one generation. So you only have 10 to the 14th power generations within the whole age of the Earth. So you have to multiply 10 to the 14th times 10 to the 30th, which is the maximum number of bacteria you could fit on the Earth, and you get 10 to the 44th power. You would not then expect a transition, an evolutionary transition that requires more than 3 or 4 nucleotides to be hit simultaneously. You could not expect to find an evolutionary transition that requires more than that. And to produce another organism from a bacteria, you would require thousands of coordinated changes. So this is why, if you have bacteria on the Earth, you would not expect to get anything other than bacteria, even after the whole age of the universe, even after trillions and trillions of times the age of the universe. By random processes, you would expect to find only bacteria on the Earth. Now, the calculations must be refined. What I mentioned is a simplistic overview. There are further refinements. But the exciting thing is, in the last 10 years, as I mentioned with Dr. Behe, the evidence seems to weigh in strongly against evolution. In other words, the evidence favors design by God.
It seems like the forces of decay would be stronger than the forces of organization. What doesn't seem to be taken into consideration by the evolutionists is that there are like forces which push towards, less organization than forces that push towards organization, or something like that within the laws of physics or biology.
I wouldn't use that. I wouldn't say it that way. The forces of decay are applicable to the prebiotic situation, when you're trying to get amino acids randomly in the soup to build up the cells. Mm-hmm. Once you have a cell, it's stable. It reproduces itself.
Oh, I see.
So we're not talking about the forces of decay.
But isn't there a force of decay in the very fact that cells can mutate? Yeah. But you say that is a force of decay, like when the sun, the ultraviolet rays, force you to produce junk proteins. That's a force of decay.
Yeah, that's a force of decay, but cells clean themselves up. That's why the mutation rate is as low as it is, 10 to the minus 9th or 10 to the minus 10th.
Oh, I see.
Because cells clean them up.
Mm-hmm.
They weed them out. And cells that can't do that die out. And since you have many other cells, they immediately take their place. So a cell is a self-reproducing machine. It keeps on going nicely. A bacterium is optimized, like a race car is optimized for speed. A bacterium is optimized for survival. That's why by this argument I just gave, you wouldn't expect to get anything other than bacteria. Survival of the fittest, well, the bacteria are the most fit. You're not going to get anything else. Even after trillions of times the age of the universe, on an earthly planet, you're only going to get more bacteria. In fact, what I'm dealing with is the flagellum. You're not even going to get a bacterium which requires a new structure that has 50 proteins, which is the motor, the flagellum that propels modern bacteria around. You can't even go from a bacterium with no flagellum to a bacterium with a flagellum in a time period trillions of times longer than the age of the universe. What to speak of a bacterium that turns into some other kind of organism?
So what you're saying is that you'll get only what you have.
Yeah. There is no evidence for macroevolution. There's only evidence for microevolution. In other words, penicillin resistance in bacteria or rats.
Okay.
You never see a rat turn into a cat. There is simply no evidence that for crossing the species boundary. This is an important point we have to keep in mind. Macroevolution means that one kind of creature turns into another kind of creature. And there is no evidence for it. It is a theory in search of evidence. I should emphasize here that the the theory of evolution was designed to explain how all organisms on Earth can happen by chance, by random events. So the theory of evolution says that by such random processes you do transform a bacterium or a single-celled creature into fish, trilobites, reptiles, amphibians, dinosaurs, mammals, and ultimately human beings. They say that that occurred. This is what the theory of evolution is based on. However, all the calculations, as I was describing, indicate that the time periods you need for such transformations are trillions of times longer than the age of the universe. So our understanding of molecular biology or biochemistry does not support evolution. And the theory of evolution, by the way, was founded before they knew hardly anything about biochemistry. Darwin just saw the cell as a simple bag, because that's what it looked like under the microscopes of his time. They had no idea about DNA and proteins, which were only discovered in detail since the 1950s.
So basically science is in need of a new theory.
Yeah, the theory of evolution was conceived during a time when scientists knew almost nothing about the complexity of cells.
So inherent in the theory of evolution is ignorance about the real state of things.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The theory is based on ignorance of the real facts of biochemistry.
An evolutionist, how would he cope with hard mathematical proof? What would they do?
They would be ruined, basically. Their theory would be ruined. If someone came up with a very precise calculation, taking into account all of the kinds of mutations you're dealing with in the cell, and showing that to produce a cell or to produce an evolutionary transition from one cell organism to any other kind of organism, if you could show that that requires time periods trillions of times the age of the universe, their theory would be finished.
And if the theory of evolution is finished, then the whole picture of the creation of the universe is finished also.
An impersonal creation, then you have to deal with the designer, namely God.
I mean the whole idea of an impersonal creation is totally ruined if you ruin Darwin's. And then the scientists, the atheistic scientists, they're basically left with nothing.
Yes.
And that's, I guess, why they psychologically cling so firmly to what they have.
Yeah, that's right. That's why they cling desperately. And what they do is they say no one has yet produced a precise enough calculation. That is the present defense.
But isn't it also a question of, because the only thing that seems to be the alternative is the Genesis of the Bible. But there are other Genesis mentioned in other scriptures.
Yeah, why should one narrow himself down to a particular creation scenario?
But isn't that the problem for atheistic, Western atheistic evolutionists?
Yeah, that has definitely been a problem. That is the real problem, because they thought that the only alternative was the Christian account or the biblical account of creation.
Now, as devotees of Krishna, we have come across other forms of Genesis. Wouldn't that be like an interesting option to present to a hardline atheistic scientist? And I would like to ask you if you've tried that.
What first you do is, if you can establish design based on calculation, that there must be a designer, then someone would say, well, maybe you have a group of advanced aliens from other planets who designed Earth-based life. Mm-hmm. And that's perfectly logical. But then another logical step that one must take is, if those aliens, if terrestrial life is so complicated that it requires design, then these aliens are more complicated. So then to postulate a random evolutionary process on another planet, it sounds less logical at every moment, the more you think about it. So now you have human beings and terrestrial life produced by aliens who are more complicated, and impersonal evolutionary forces couldn't produce them, so you need another group of aliens that are more complicated than them. So ultimately you have an infinite regress. And that's why In fact, logically, at some point you must admit a transcendental designer whose body is not composed of insentient subunits. This is why and the Vedas, in fact, give such an account. This is what is exciting. This is why we should not narrow ourselves down to one particular creation scenario. We should consider the Vedas, which actually say that you have a transcendental designer, namely Vishnu, or Krishna, and he gives the subtle blueprints to Prajapatis, specifically to Brahma, the first Prajapati. And Brahma gives these blueprints to another set of lesser Prajapatis who actually design, they are the designers, or they implement the design, which the real designer is Vishnu. Vishnu actually gives the design to Brahma. Brahma gives the design to the Prajapatis, like Daksha and Angira, these very powerful sages or Prajapatis, and they actually put the design into physical hardware, into DNA and proteins.
So what you're saying in essence is actually if evolution is not possible, the information or the blueprint of life in matter must exist in an absolute state somewhere.
Yes, there must be ultimately a transcendental designer who has created the blueprint.
Because there doesn't seem to be any other possibilities than these two.
I mean, someone could hope to say that another kind of primordial soup on another planet could give rise to...
But when you look at that is even more fantastic.
It's even more fantastic because we already admit that the designers of terrestrial life must be more complicated than terrestrial life. And whatever kind of molecular organization you have on another planet, you still have to deal with the situation like with 3 nucleotides encoding 1 amino acid. You've still got words in a code of some sort that have to be worked out. And so then the mathematics of it argues against evolution on any planet.
Of course, you could argue that on another level of material existence, maybe
Behe mentions like electromagnetic fields. Imagine you have a life form that's based on electromagnetic fields, not even based on hardware. But no one has any idea how you have stable electromagnetic fields with the high information content required for life.
Yeah, what I was trying to say is somebody might say in a completely different part of the universe, evolution might be possible due to the setup of physics there, and they could then travel to Earth with.
That's right. Yeah. So that's what someone would try to argue. Some evolutionists might.
But do they seriously argue then that life comes from space?
Well, Hoyle argues that.
He didn't become very popular by that argument.
Well, he first did some calculations to show that evolution doesn't work on Earth. And then he has some data, spectroscopic data, saying that there's evidence for bacteria floating in space. So he combines these two pieces of evidence to indicate that life comes from other planets. As far as whether it was designed on another planet, as I was mentioning, the problems that confront evolution on this planet, you've been dealing with the same kind of problems anywhere, because you have complexity. You have information content which is very high in living systems, unavoidably. A living system means complexity. You can't get around it. I mean, we think computers are complicated. A computer is nothing compared to a cell. It is nothing.
And still the computer did not come about by random.
Yeah, no rational person would say that a computer happens by random chance, especially the computer programmers, software designers, and people who actually worked on the computers. And who spent, worked 10 hours a day for 20 years to produce various kinds of computers, try to tell them that it would happen by accident. And a cell is 1,000,000 times more complicated than a computer. The basic point is evolution appears not to work anywhere in the universe by these calculations I mentioned. If that fact is solidly established, that evolution or random things don't produce order, then terrestrial life was designed by aliens, and if you want to have another set of aliens who designed them, they have to be more complicated, or at least as complicated. So you have an infinite regress of ever more complicated material forms, and that doesn't work. Because in the material world, you don't have infinite regresses of material forms. At some point, you have to rationally postulate a designer who has a non-material body.
Yeah, otherwise it wouldn't work.
Yeah, a body that doesn't have DNA and proteins.
And who could exist absolutely.
Right. That exists at a higher level of existence, not dependent on the kind of biochemical reactions that
because unless that is absolute or eternal, then he or that would also have to have a source somewhere.
Right.
So you have to...
Right, so it's quite rational then at that point to say that there is a designer who has an eternal existence, who is transcendental.
That would not be unscientific.
This is all science. So far we haven't cited any scripture.
No.
We're just talking science and logic.
There is some evidence or some accounts that alien life has visited Earth.
Oh, there's abundant evidence for that. Air Force reports, top secret declassified Air Force reports.
That in itself would seem to put a terrible blow to the evolution theory, because if you accept that life originated by mutations and selection, natural selection on Earth, and now we're visited by these beings who look like human beings, like the Greys or even the Nordics, who claim to come from, planets, and they look exactly like humans. Now, how do the evolutionists explain this? Because this seems to be now you're in a much greater, mathematical problem.
Yeah, to have evolution occur again independently on another planet.
Yeah, and coming up with the same species almost.
Right. That would be ridiculously low probability. So evolutionists ignore extraterrestrial evidence, typically.
They do, huh?
Yeah, these blockheaded materialists, the dogmatic materialists, they ignore evidence for reincarnation. Most of them ignore ESP. They ignore extraterrestrial evidence. Yeah, they have a certain mindset, a kind of tunnel vision in which extraterrestrial evidence doesn't exist. I've gone to universities and distributed a preliminary copy of something that I've been working on, which has well-documented Air Force reports, names of generals. It has several sections. The first section is these Air Force reports, and they're non-sensational because no one stands to make any money or get any fame. In fact, they tried to cover it up. The government tried to cover it up for many years, starting in 1947 with Roswell.
Everyone knows about Roswell.
I'm citing some Air Force reports. I give the names of generals, page references to reports. I mean, it's black and white. It's very solid evidence.
Is this also what some of this may appear also in the Alien Identities book?
A little bit. I just did much more. Yeah, Sadāpūta has a little bit. Dr. Richard Thompson has some evidence in his book. I just did a little more along those regards.
Okay.
And give the history of the Air Force's involvement, the Air Force investigation, Project Blue Book, Project Sign, Project Grudge, and other things that went on. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
It definitely indicates that we are regularly being visited by advanced extraterrestrial beings.
But your point is slightly different than the point in Sadāpūta's book, because you're aiming at this mathematical proof.
Yeah, that's what I'm aiming at in this book. That is in a later chapter. I'm discussing a specific example using the bacterial motor, which is called the flagellum.
And how does this relate to the UFO sightings?
Well, the UFO sightings simply indicates that there are advanced extraterrestrial beings. And the mathematical analysis also indicates that life must have been designed by extraterrestrial beings.
Okay.
So they support each other.
that is actually your argument, that we come from space, and these beings trace back from an absolute being.
Yeah. Yeah, if you put it all together as we've been describing it, it makes a very strong case for us being designed by higher beings and higher beings being designed by God, ultimately, in order to avoid an infinite regress of ever more complicated materially embodied creators.
Now, this must be quite different from the line of argument brought about by the Christian scientists, because usually Christians don't accept life on other planets just like that, or do they?
Some do, some don't. Christians are not monolithic. There are many splinter groups, each with his own ideas. Some Christians try to literally accept the Bible. Others say that the 7 days of God's creation each day amounts to hundreds of millions of years to fit into the
One day of Brahma?
Something, not quite that long, but the Christians are not monolithic. They have nothing uniform, because there's not much information given in the Bible, so therefore much speculation arises around it.
Okay.
Michelangelo's picture of God with muscles is speculation.
Yeah.
Speculating on the nature of God's form, because there wasn't much information in the Bible. Somewhere there is, in one of the Psalms, I think Solomon is praying to God and describing some aspects which sounds a lot like Brahma Samhita, interestingly enough. Mm-hmm. This is, you could say, one of the esoteric passages of the Bible in which Solomon is talking about the transcendental form of God, certainly not mentioning muscles, because obviously God wouldn't have a body like this, which is so weak and fallible and breaks down and gets old. Obviously God is not going to have such a body. He'll have a transcendental body, a body not composed of these kinds of elements. So there may be some small references in the Bible and perhaps also in the Quran, but in the Vedas, the form of God is elaborately described in thousands of pages again and again and again in Srimad Bhagavatam, Brahma Samhita, Bhakti Rasamrita, Sindhu, Chaitanya Charitamrita, the standard books of Vedic knowledge which have been translated by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami from Sanskrit into English and modern languages. So the Vedas simply give the most complete picture. If you accept design from the arguments I've given, and you want more information about the designer, then I would suggest a rich field of, or a rich source of such information would be the Vedas, and it's most complete of all such sources.
Have you had any discussions with Christian scientists about the Vedic point of view of creation and paralleled it with a Christian?
No, I haven't, but I could imagine an open-minded Christian could accept the Vedas if they accept each day of the 7-day creation story in Genesis to mean a long time period, like a manvantar. A manvantar is about 300 million years. Then in fact, 7 of such periods brings you to around 2 billion years, which is what we say the age of the universe is, because we're in the 7th manvantar out of 14. We're in the middle of the day of Brahma. So our understanding is that the beginning of the process of creation of terrestrial life would have occurred about 2 billion years ago, since we're halfway through a day of Brahma, which is 14 manvantars. So an open-minded Christian should be interested, because the Vedas contain such a rich source of information about the designer and the whole power structure that the designer has set up, the Lord Brahma and the Prajapatis underneath him. Because why would God need to deal with all the nuts and bolts? He would work through other persons who are interested in material power and organization. Just as the President of America, he doesn't have to deal with all the nuts and bolts and duties of the post office. A leader of a country, he delegates, he sets up a power structure. Secretary of State is in charge of this, and then the post office. There's a whole system of minor, power-hungry persons who are controlling the different aspects. So similarly, that's how the Vedas describe that God created.
There is an element of decay in the Vedic creation as, the 4 ages, and where it's described that humankind actually goes through a process of decay in consciousness.
I would use the word degradation.
Degradation.
Decay in science means that something breaks down and becomes totally non-functional.
Okay, that's the wrong word.
Yeah, degradation.
A degradation
of human beings, so that...
Could you say the degradation of the human genome?
I don't know that it happens at the level of the genome, because the word genome means the total DNA of the organism. And the DNA, as we know, every 3 nucleotides codes for 1 amino acid. But we don't know even how you get the shape of the head or the shape of your hand. We don't know. It's called developmental biology, how you go from a single fertilized cell that when the sperm meets the egg, how you go from that to the shape of the body, that's a subject of great investigation now.
And you're saying nobody really knows that?
Right. It may be that the instructions for the external shape of the body is not at all encoded in the DNA. Maybe there are higher fields, like morphogenetic fields. There's an English scientist named Rupert Sheldrake, an English biologist, who writes about morphogenetic fields, that the DNA is not enough to explain a living organism. Of course, the Vedas would say that because the Vedas deal with the transcendental Jivatma, who's a unit of consciousness, the real person, the consciousness. Our thinking, feeling, and willing is not based on biochemistry. It's based on a transcendental element called the Jivatma, the conscious self.
And then the Jivatma is covered by the
subtle body. So it may well be that the subtle body contains the information for organizing the shape of the gross body. And as a matter of fact, there's independent empirical evidence for this, because Ian Stevenson, in his 2 newest books, published in 1997, called Reincarnation and Biology, he has hundreds of photographs of birthmarks correlated with death wounds on the previous personality I mentioned earlier, in my earlier interviews, the case of Corliss Chopkin Jr. No one knows yet how you relate these nucleotides to the external shape of the body. And the fact that death wounds on the body, which create an impression in the mind or the subtle body, later on give rise to birthmarks which have the same shape and are located in the same position on the body, indicates that the subtle body has a strong role in organizing the external shape of the gross body. For example, in Stevenson's book, these are 2 fat books. They're about 2,000 pages. It's called Reincarnation and Biology, published in 1997 from Prager publishers. Very exciting. What Stevenson has is cases like a young girl, a teenage girl, was killed with a knife by an assassin who used a knife and made a cut across her ribs, very characteristic and unusual cut. So she was killed in that way, and then in her next life she recalled this life, and she has on her the little body of the girl in her next life has a birthmark with the same shape. With exactly the same shape as the knife wound, in the same place on the ribs. And in many cases, Stevenson goes back and gets detailed autopsies and finds medical records, independent of the statement of the child, as another check, independent reference. He finds medical records and where it's described the death wound and the position, location of the death wound, described in good detail. So he's able to find that there's strong evidence that the subtle body actually does play a major role in organizing the shape and features of the gross physical body. So it's another strong evidence against the materialistic worldview, where everything is just matter, biochemistry, and nothing more than biochemistry.
Then the whole idea of DNA, and it's quite shaky, isn't it?
Well, it's very clear that DNA codes for proteins, and that's a fact. No one can argue against that. Trillions of observations, as I mentioned earlier. But what is not a fact is that a person is only biochemistry. The exciting thing about Stevenson's work, which I have quoted numerous times in previous interviews, is that it indicates that we are more than just the body. That the real self is higher than the body, beyond the biochemistry of the body. And the real self determines the shape of the gross physical body. Now, To be more complete, we should mention that the entire human genome has not been sequenced, so there may be some information in the DNA which determines some aspect of the form. We don't know yet. It's a very complicated field, developmental biology, from a single cell to the full organism. But certainly, if a materialist tried to claim at present that there's only biochemistry, that would be unjustified. He has no power to claim that at present. And Ian Stevens' evidence is positive evidence against the materialistic claim that the biochemistry is everything, the full description of a living entity. So this is what I'm mentioning in the last 10 years, how further research in the field of science is supporting more and more the Vedic view of a non-physical spirit's soul, the conscious self, the Atma, in a body designed by the Supreme God, Vishnu or Krishna.
You're mentioning that you're working on this mathematical proof to tear evolutionism apart.
Yeah.
How much more time do you need to have it completely finished?
I don't know. The problem is extremely complicated. I'm in communication with top-level scientists at UC Berkeley and other universities. I'm trying to put together something we can publish in top-level scientific journals. But it's not clear because now I'm dealing with the protein folding problem. There are different ways to get a useful protein. You can put different amino acids in different places, so it makes the computation very complicated. But we need to actually defeat evolution totally and solidly, completely finish it, you need a very precise calculation. So that someone could not say, but, maybe, and if, perhaps. To cut out all the maybes, ifs, buts, and perhapses, we need a really good calculation. I don't know, it might take decades.
But you feel you're getting there somehow.
I feel that I'm defining the problem. In the field of this motor in the bacterium, what's exciting is that thousands of papers have been published on it. So much research, they have so much information on the complexity of this motor. It's fascinating motor. So what I've done is put it all together to try to show what evolution would have to do to produce such a motor. And let's see if we can get a precise calculation out of it. I don't know, because the system is so complicated. Even a bacterium, even one part of a bacterium is fantastically complicated. Certainly it would be ludicrous for an evolutionist to claim that evolution is proven. And in fact, some evolutionists like to say evolution is no longer a theory, now it's a fact. The actual situation is evolution is not even a theory. They haven't even put together a solid theory. And in fact, all the evidence that I have mentioned throughout this and other interviews indicates that evolution does not work. So really, the bulk of evidence, the vast majority of evidence, is strongly against evolution at present, and strongly in favor of design to round up the picture. There's another element in the picture, is that Krishna satisfies the desires of atheists to avoid him. If the proof is too strong, then they'll be forced, and that would compromise their free will. Just as Lord Chaitanya revealed to Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya in Madhya Lila chapter 6, Chaitanya Charitamrita, that this whole Mayavadi philosophy was created by Lord Shiva in the guise of Shankaracharya deliberately. Lord Vishnu came to Lord Shiva one day and said, create a kind of ignorance to accelerate the age of Kali so that people will forget about me, God. So they will become more absorbed in material life. So Darwin's theory is simply one aspect of this illusory atheistic conception, which is, in fact, allowable in the age of Kali. It's given because the atheists get their field day. Krishna is so liberal that he gives even the fools the chance to be fools if they want. So we're simultaneously, the devotees are trying to inject real knowledge into society, but Krishna doesn't allow it to be so strong that the atheist's free will is compromised. This is the principle of ignorance, which runs the whole material world. Everyone has come here to deliberately avoid the designer. So if you produce a proof that's too strongly in favor of design, you've counteracted the whole purpose of material existence. The atheists will go, oh no. Nothing would be more heart-rending, more heartbreaking for the atheist than an irrefutable proof for the existence of God. That's the worst disaster conceivable. Better that the graves take over the planet and use everyone as guinea pigs in their laboratories. That's better. That's better than to admit that there's a supreme Godhead and that we're supposed to worship and glorify Him, and that's our real life.
But still, Krishna inspired Śrīla Prabhupāda to start the BI, so there must be something to it.
There is, even in the age of ignorance, the simultaneous injection into human society of real knowledge for the sane persons who want it. However, sane persons can be in a minority at certain times, like Kali Yuga.
So again, I guess it's a question of desire. Do you want to know? Or?
Krishna allows both things. You've got ignorance and knowledge. If you want ignorance, Krishna creates a whole system. Organized universities, Darwin theory, everything. This sounds very logical. You can be in a whole illusory world in ignorance and think you know everything. Krishna allows that. And simultaneously, Prabhupada's information, the Vedas, and the kind of work I'm trying to do is inject real knowledge.
But if somebody, like many will, insist on, believing in atheistic explanations, what then is the use to try to convince them?
Because not everyone is a dogmatic atheist. There's a range, there's a mid-range of persons who, given a good argument, will actually become interested in theism. If the whole society were composed of rabid atheists, by rabid I mean crazy, dogmatic, die-hard materialists, then there's no point in saying anything.
No, that's true.
And in fact, that's the end of the age of Kali. And then Kalki comes and does his business because there's no point in talking. At that point, they're all too foolish to hear anything. So no need to talk at that point. But we haven't reached that point yet. And Lord Chaitanya definitely wants, and Prabhupada wants. So that is necessary that we give people a choice. Otherwise, if you don't have knowledge, they have only ignorance. Imagine a kid raised and gone to the public schools and only Darwin's theory. He doesn't know anything else. He has no choice. And we follow authorities automatically, even the most rebellious. Everyone quotes, even the most rebellious punk on the street is quoting Darwin's, how when we were apes in the jungle, to justify his ape-like mentality.
Thanks for coming to the studio and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Og det var så Stephen Bernard, eller som han hedder, Madhavendra Puri, fra Kalifornien, som her er i Danmark for tiden, som gav os lidt indsigt i hans seneste projekter. Det var Madhavendra, der stod for produktion og interview. Tak for nu. Hare Krishna, og på genhør en anden gang, måske med Madhavendra Puri i studiet.